The moment is here, you can stop your search. It's Comics by Perch.
Hey everybody, it's Perch. I get asked from time to time, how hard is it to convert from a comic book style, a Western comic book style, into a manga style? And specifically what I mean by that is not the art, not the change the way people draw, although I think the mechanics of how you draw may need to shift a little bit if you're an artist. But more the business, more the, hey, it seems like there's this popular format, smaller page size, collected kind of volumes that you're seeing in places. And, is it time to start learning what that format looks like? Is it time to start kind of figuring out how to make comics that fit that style? And the answer is yes, in the sense of, if you work in comics, it's wise to kind of understand what's going on in other places, how it can adapt to you, what's popular, kind of keeping your eye on the ball, so to speak, of where the industry is going is smart. Just, full stop, smart. And if you're in the business of doing comics, it's obvious that you've got this format that seems to be taking off in a bunch of places that, comic books used to be, or comic books would like to be today. And there needs to be some adaptation to that format, or at least at least an attempt to go play in that space. Here's some basic thoughts on how to do it, but I want to preface this by saying, the manga format, I think, is something we're going to live with for a long time. And again, I'm not talking about the art style. I'm talking about the smaller pages printed in the tankobon style. You've seen that format. I think that format is one that is going to work. And I say that from a perspective of, look, Scholastic is moving more and more to it, and you're seeing those volumes. You've got kids who are growing up with, Dogman or Babysitter Club or stuff like that, depending on what they're into. And so as they get older, they're going to be familiar with that format. The format's going to work for them. There's a reason why comics printed in the size that they are. There's some logistical reasons why they were printed in that size as opposed to a true kind of 8.5 by 11 or magazine format. Magazines are coming in a little bit bigger. But when a lot of kids, got into comics, that was the format. So as they got older, there were attempts to make trade paperbacks bigger or the more common kind of size for that thing. There's been attempts to make the comics themselves bigger, but you had this combination of, the artists had acclimated to a certain format, and the more importantly, the customers had gone to a certain format. So the customers are like, anything that looks bigger looks like a fake knockoff product. And so, you're going to have that same effect with the manga tankobon style. As these kids grow older, the comic book size is just going to feel foreign or old-fashioned. And that will increasingly happen. So it's something you have to at least look at. By the way, things could change. If I'm predicting the future, comic books get really popular, that size format gets to be the standard, then it will, it will take over. Or, manga decides to increase their page size. There are a lot of things could happen, but the general rule of thumb is the dominant format is going to start to dictate what all the other formats look like. And in terms of sales volume and, presence in stores, that YA Scholastic manga format is going to work. So if you're an artist or a comic creator, I think it's wise to start looking at that. But a couple things to understand. First off, the manga format in general, and YA for that matter, part of the inherent nature of putting those things together is that it lends itself to a quicker art style. It's usually rougher, quicker art. In the case of manga, it's definitely quicker line art, but also you've got a team of people doing backgrounds and other things, not just the one artist. And so if you're like Alex Ross and you're thinking, well, I'm going to have to go head to head with manga, that's probably a bad idea. I have no idea how quick Alex Ross produces a picture, but looks labor intensive, let's just say. And I think that's a factor that has to be considered. You can't kind of, take a lot of time on the page as an artist. If you do really nice, highly detailed, rendered, painted work in some cases, you're in for a lot of pain unless you could do that incredibly quickly, unless you are Mark Bailey level of speed. The other factor is, I think there's a bit of a misnomer here. When people look at manga in the US, they see these, tankobon collected formats. In effect, and it's not exactly, this isn't exactly analogous, but you're seeing a trade paperback. So these chapters that appear inside the Tankobon came out as individual chapters, and they were solicited that way. They were marketed that way. There's a heartbeat and a cadence to how they hit the market that were, a chapter by chapter kind of a format. And so, if you're trying to set off to say, I'm going to make I'm going to adapt to manga, I've got to make, 120 or 180 pages into this tankobon. That's what a comic book must be. You're probably making a mistake on a couple levels. That those versions that you saw, if you're picking up a Demon Slayer, you're picking up a One Piece, you're seeing a number of chapters all collected. And so the construction of those chapters, both the writing, kind of the cadence of the story, how it's going to flow, where the big cliffhangers are going to be, etc., they're happening chapter by chapter. So they're happening actually in a really small format. Sometimes 12, 14 pages is the chapter. And so, as you build your story, you have to keep that in mind, because the way it reads is not like one big ass long story. It reads like a bunch of chapters that form an arc. And that's also a different way. Now, if you're trying to adapt to manga as a style, that's probably good news for you, because it means that you can kind of ease into it a little slower. You just have to worry about, say, 12 pages and getting kind of a chapter down, and then you make another chapter. If you look at it and say, I've got to fill an entire tankobon with material, it depends on the personality type, but that's going to defeat a lot of people, because it just feels like a lot of work. And that doesn't instill a lot of confidence and passion for getting some of this stuff done. So you need to, short answer, you need to pace yourself, or you need to just be a little bit careful of kind of how this story is coming together. In terms of the art itself, as I mentioned, it's kind of a looser format. You notice a lot of manga, a lot of YA stuff. It's not over rendered. There tends to be a kind of a real, flow to some of these stories that are, so I don't want to say organic, but it's because you're reading a lot at a time, and because you're reading these chapters, there's also things like, backgrounds and other pieces can sometimes be suggestive, as opposed to, thoroughly detailed out. It's not as necessary to do all that work. And so I think that there comes another kind of general flow. The book needs to read fast. So one of the things that a lot of people who read manga see very quickly is the entire story kind of flows through quick. It doesn't read like, put it this way, reading Watchmen, the trade paperback, is very different from reading, I don't know, a volume of Chainsaw Man. And not just because of the story tone and the content, but also just the speed at which you read the story and flow through it. So there's kind of almost a whole different sequential art, storytelling technique that's used. And there's a million other differences too. I think dialogue has to be thoughtful in terms of how it goes. You need to keep the pace of turning the pages fast. And I think for a lot of artists, I think there's been a few I know who've tried this format, tried to kind of adapt to it, and they find it, tough, because the story drags down in certain areas, both in the pacing and the dialogue and everything else, and it becomes more of a slog. Well, in effect, you're making kind of a Western graphic novel. You're making a trade paperback for yourself. You're not actually making a manga. You're not adapting to the style you're trying to copy. And that may be cool. Maybe your graphic novel may be amazing, and that's what you want to do, and that's the story you want to tell, and that's completely fine too. But if your goal is to kind of copy and learn, then you need to understand it's more than just pages, more than just the size. Of course, the size is a factor, so this also lends itself more to the looser page. You got to be comfortable with how your art's going to be scaled, and probably do some test prints on all that. Even with printing getting better in a lot of places, what you don't want to do is, kind of over-render a page at a big size and then get these very, dense, clouded, cloggy pages of art. And you also need to deal with the fact that, black and white is more accepted, more dominant there. And so, how you do screens and how you do, color tones and all the rest of this kind of stuff, it also plays a factor to the readability of your book. But it is definitely worth looking at. I think if you're an artist, you definitely need to kind of have an eye to, if you have commercial ambitions, if you want to get your book more places and have it, have a few more options for success in terms of where it's marketed and going, then this is a format you can't ignore. You're going to have to, at least have some kind of answer or story to it. Anyway, I hope that kind of sums up all the different questions I've had. What do you think people need to worry about if you're going from a Western comic size to a manga size? What would you recommend, or what's a nuance you think got left out here? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe, of course, and thanks for listening.